Alright, it says I'm live. I'm going to continue on here with the Minecraft listening to Jordan Peterson. This video is called 5 Hours for the Next 50 Years of Your Life. And waiting on the Xbox to load up. I got a new microphone now, so it'll sound better from here on in. Hopefully. Alright. Get this started. Go ahead and start the video. Jordan Peterson back where I think I left off.
Rest the crowd and show off, and she was afraid.
And I'm pretty much not going to talk too much. Just going to play the game and listen. I just want to check the sound levels here. I'm sorry for pausing on that again. Oh my god. Let's see. Close that. Let's see. That game volume's sounding a bit loud. Just give me just a second here. Oh, come on now. Are you fucking kidding me? Are you fucking kidding me? What happened, dude? I don't want your resource packs. I just don't. Alright, that'll probably be good. And now I want to start the video. I'll continue on. Like I said, I'm not going to talk too much. We're just going to listen here. And if I need to chime in or anything, I will. So enjoy it.
To go up there because she thought people would push her towards the snake and she'd have to touch it. And so there was a fear of the crowd issue going on there too. And I said, well, just look, go up there, but do it under these conditions. Is that, you know, if people get pushy, what are you going to tell them? And so we figured out something. He said, look, you just tell them that, you know, you want to look at the snake at your own pace and that you don't need any encouragement or help, and it would be good if you were just left alone. So that enabled her to defend herself. So she was afraid that the crowd would push her to do something that she didn't want to do. That was part of the theme of the dream. So anyway, she eventually climbed the dune in her imagination and went into the crowd, and the crowd turned out to be quite welcoming and not hostile and not pushy, which isn't what you'd expect, right? Because you'd think the crowd would have reacted in accordance with her fears since it was her fantasy. But that's the thing about fantasies. They have this autonomous quality. But the crowd was welcoming and not hostile, and it turned out that the snake handler wasn't a charlatan. He was just an old guy who had this snake, and he was out there just showing it to people because he thought it was a cool thing, and that maybe it was good for people to come and look at a snake. And so she got close enough to the snake to touch it. And so I'm telling you that because I want you to understand a bit more about what Jung was trying to do. And so he wrote these books, notebooks that haven't been published yet, called the Black Books. And the Black Books are the documentation of his experiments with his imagination. And what he would do is daydream, like a child daydreams. He regained that faculty, although I think with Jung it was a faculty that had never really disappeared. And he had figures of imagination that came to him that he could speak with. And he spoke with these figures of imagination and documented that over a very long period of time. And that was eventually distilled into a book called The Red Book, which was published about 3 or 4 years ago. And it was a book that Jung regarded as the central source from which all his inspiration emerged. It was sort of, the way it looks to me is that we embody a lot of information in our action, right? And our action has developed as a consequence of imitating other people. And not only the people around us, but of course the people around us imitated the people who came before them, and those people imitated the people who came before them, and so on, so far back that it's as far back as you can go. And so you embody these patterns of behavior that are extremely informative, that you don't understand, that are a consequence of collective imitation across the centuries. And so then those patterns can become manifest as figures of the imagination. And those figures of imagination are the distillations of patterns of behavior. And so as the distillations of patterns of behavior, they have content. And it's not you, that content. It's You could even think about it as content that's evolved, although it's culturally transmitted. It's content that's evolved. And so these figures of the imagination can reveal the structure of reality to you. And that's what happened with Jung, and that's what he described in the Red Book, and that was what permeated his psychology, a psychology that was based on the presupposition that the fundamental archetypal structures of religious belief were not pathological, not deceitful, not protective in some delusional sense against the fear of death, but quite the contrary. The very stories that enabled us to move forward as confident human beings in the face of chaos itself. And it's conceivable, I think perhaps probable, that nothing more important conceptually happened in the 20th century than that. Because it was the first time post-Enlightenment that a rapprochement between the intellect and the underlying religious archetypal substructure occurred. You have in the capacious intellect of Jung, and the same thing happened to some degree with Piaget, the religious domain and the factual domain were brought back together. And the fact of Jung's enduring and increasing popularity and influence, I would say, is a direct consequence of that. Now, some of his work was spun off into the New Age, and the New Age is a very optimistic and naive movement. It's predicated on the idea that you can do nothing, say, but follow your bliss, and that will take you ever higher to enlightenment, and that's not the Jungian idea at all. The Jungian idea is that what you most need will be found where you least want to look. So there's this story, King Arthur. There's this story of King Arthur. They're all in a round table, right? King Arthur and his knights, they're all equals. They're all superordinate, but they're all equals. And they go off to look for the Holy Grail. And the Holy Grail is the container of the redemptive substance, whatever that is. It might be the cup that Christ used at the Last Supper, or it might be a chalice that was used to capture his blood on the cross, right, when he was pierced by a sword. The stories differ, but that's the Holy Grail, and the Holy Grail is lost. That's the redemptive substance, and the knights of King Arthur go off to search for the Holy Grail, but they don't know where to look. So where do you look when you don't know where to look for something you need desperately but have lost? Well, each of the knights goes into the forest at the point that looks darkest to him. And that's Jungian psychoanalysis in a nutshell. It's like that which you fear and avoid, that which you hold in contempt, that which disgusts you and that you avoid. That's the gateway to what you need to know. There's nothing New Age about that. That's for sure. Now, Jung, when he started this endeavor, he started with this. This is part of the notebooks from the Black Book. He said, he wrote, my soul, where are you? Do you hear me? I speak. I call you. Are you there? I've returned. I'm here again. I've shaken the dust of all the lands from my feet, and I've come to you. I am with you. After long years of long wandering, I have come to you again. For the Jungians, the hero's journey is a journey within. And I think that that's probably the bias of introverts, to believe that the hero's journey is only an inward journey. I think that it can be an outward journey too, because I don't think it matters where you confront the unknown, whether it's within or without. What matters is whether or not you confront the unknown. That's what matters. But he found that what he had ignored was an undiscovered part of himself. So that might be something that was equivalent to Huxley's notion that there's tremendous potential breadth in the realm of human conscious experience. And Huxley was influenced to some degree by Jung. Now, Jung knew of Huxley's experiments and had commented on psychedelic use. And he said something like, beware of wisdom you did not earn. And Jung was very good at stating things very profoundly, very simply, and that's a very intelligent piece of advice. Beware of wisdom you did not earn. He wrote a paper, if you're interested in this sort of thing, He wrote a paper called The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, which is an absolute masterwork but completely incomprehensible unless you know what it's about. And what it's about is the danger of what he called ego inflation. And so one of the things that can happen as a consequence of a revelatory experience is that the division between the individual ego and what would you call it? It's so hard to come up with a word that isn't somehow naive or cliched. To erase the relationship, the boundary between the specific consciousness of the ego and the more generalized consciousness, and more generalized consciousness as such, is a dangerous thing to do, because you can start to equate yourself, your specific self, with that more generalized consciousness as such. And Jung thought about that as something akin to a psychotic inflation. And the paper Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious is a document that tells you how to avoid that if you're playing in this kind of realm. And one of the injunctions is to keep your feet on the ground. He thought that was partly what happened to Nietzsche, was that Nietzsche wasn't grounded enough in life. He wasn't grounded enough in day-to-day rituals and routines and the mundane. Now, you could debate whether or not that's the case, whether or not that's a reasonable argument, but that was still what Jung believed. Okay, so why am I telling you all this? I'll finish with this. From December 1913 onward, Jung carried on in the same procedure, deliberately evoking a fantasy in a waking state and then entering into it as a drama. These fantasies may be understood as a type of dramatized thinking in pictorial form. In retrospect, he recalled that his scientific question was to see what took place when he switched off consciousness. The example of dreams indicated the existence of background activity, and he wanted to give this a possibility of emerging, just as one does when taking mescaline. These journals are Jung's contemporaneous clinical ledger to his most difficult experiment, or what he later describes as a voyage of discovery to the other pole of the world. Jung believed that we were dreaming all the time, but that during waking life, the pressure of external images was such that the unconscious fantasy imagery was, or that the fantasy imagery was of insufficient magnitude to be conscious, but that we were always situated in a dream in relationship to the world. If you're hungry, it's not a deterministic drive. It's a subpersonality that has a goal, and then it has a bunch of action patterns that are going to work in reference to that goal. It has a bunch of perceptions that suit that goal, and it organizes your emotional responses around that goal. And so to think about it as a personality is it's a much more intelligent way to look at it. One of the things about Skinner's rats, you know, Skinner could get rats to do almost everything, and he would reward them with food. And so he had a simple rat model, but his rats were starved down to 75% of their normal body weight. So not only were they not social, gregarious rats like rats are, because they were isolated, they were genetically altered from wild rats, but they also weren't as complex as a real rat because they were starving. And so, but you know, a starving rat is a pretty good model of a rat, and a rat is a pretty good model of a person. But a lot of our models of simple behavioral learning were based on starving, isolated rats. So anyways, how to think about motivation? We'll think about it from the hypothalamic perspective. So we could say one thing that motivation does is set goals. We could say that emotions track progress towards goals. And I'm going to use that schema even though it's not exactly right. So you say, well, motivation determines where you're going to aim. So if you're hungry, you're going to aim at something to eat. And then that will organize your perceptions so that you zero out everything that isn't relevant to that task, which is almost everything. You concentrate on those few things that are going to facilitate your movement forward. When you encounter those things, that produces positive emotion as you move through the world towards your goal, and you see that things are laying themselves out that facilitate your movement forward. Those things cause positive emotion. And if you encounter anything that gets in the way, then that produces negative emotion, and it can be like threat, because you're not supposed to encounter something that gets in the way. It can be anger, so that you move it away. It can be frustration, disappointment, grief. Those would, if you had a response that serious to an obstacle, it would probably punish the little motivated frame right out of existence. You know, so you walk downstairs and, I don't know, the contracting company has set a wrecking ball through your kitchen. It's like That's going to be disappointing. You're not going to keep eating the peanut butter sandwich in the rubble. That little frame is going to get punished out of existence, and some new goal is going to pop up in its stead. And you know, one of the things we're going to try to sort out is how do you decide when you've encountered an obstacle that's so big that you should just quit and go do something else, because that's not obvious, you know. And you can get into counterproductive persistence pretty easily. So we don't know how people solve that problem. It's a really complicated one. So anyways, we're going to work on that scenario. Your hypothalamus pops up micro goals that are directly relevant to biological survival. That produces a frame of reference. So it's not a goal, it's not a drive, and it's not a collection of behaviors. It's a little personality. And the personality has a viewpoint, it has thoughts that go along with it. It has perceptions, it has action tendencies, all of that. You can see this in addiction, most particularly. So one of the things that you find often with people who are alcoholic is they lie all the time. And that's because when they've built a little alcohol dependent personality inside of themselves, or a big one, maybe it's 90% of their personality. And one of the things that consists of is all the rationalizations that they've used over the years to justify their addiction to themselves and to other people. And so the addiction has a personality, you know. And so when the person is off, or maybe they're addicted to meth or something like that, where you know the addiction is more, it's more short-term powerful, than I would say, than an alcohol addiction. They'll say anything, and the words are just tools used to get towards the goal. And if they happen to be deceptive, whatever, it doesn't matter. They're just practical tools to get towards the goal. And then when you get towards the goal and you take a nice shot of meth or something like that, you reinforce all those rationales that you used to get the drug, and then the next time you're even a better deceiver and liar. So okay, so we're going to say motivations, one way of thinking about it is they set goals, but it's not the right way of thinking about it. They produce a whole framework of interpretation. And so we're going to think about that framework of interpretation. And then emotions emerge inside of that. So that's it. So the world is framed, motivation set goals. You could say the world has to be framed. So motivation sets that frame, goals, emotions, perceptions, and actions. And then actions track progress. So positive emotion says you're moving forward properly towards your goal. And if you encounter something you don't expect, you stop. That's anxiety. It's like, oh, we're not where we thought we were. And so we don't know what to do. So we should stop, because we don't know where we are or what we're doing. Stop, frozen. And then the more powerful negative emotions like pain, they might make you get out of there. So emotions, forward, stop, reverse. That's your emotions within that motivated frame. So, and that's another example of how your mind is embedded in your body. Your emotions are like they're offshoots of action tendencies. That's the right way to think about it, because action is everything fundamentally. So what are some basic motivations? Most of these are regulated by the hypothalamus, by the way, and that tells you just how important a control system it is. The other thing that's useful to know about the hypothalamus is that it has projections going up from it that are like tree trunks, and inhibitory projections coming down that are like grapevines. So you can kind of control your hypothalamus as long as it's not on too much. But if it's on in any serious way, it's like it wins. So partly what you do to stop yourself from falling under the dominion of your hypothalamus is to never ever be anywhere where its action is necessary, right? You don't want to go into a biker bar, because you might find yourself in a situation where panicked defensive aggression is immediately necessary. You probably don't want that. You don't want the panic, you don't want the terror, you don't want the frenzied fight, you don't want any of that. You don't want to have to run away in absolute panic. So you just don't go there. And a huge part of how we regulate our emotions is just by never going anywhere where we have to experience them. And so that has very little to do with internal inhibitory control, and everything to do with staying where you belong. So, okay. So, basic motivations: hunger, thirst, pain. Pain is not regulated by the hypothalamus. That's a different circuit. Anger/aggression, thermoregulation, panic and escape, affiliation and care, sexual desire, exploration, play. And you can kind of break those in. You can kind of break those into the classic Darwinian categories too, and say, well, there's a set of motivations that go along with self-maintenance. That'd be your survival. Ingestive and defensive. See, I've sort of coded them there. So the self-maintenance, there's an adgestive set of basic motivations that go with self-maintenance. You say that's hunger, thirst. There's a set of defensive motivations: pain, anger, thermoregulation, panic, and escape. And then there's motivations that are associated with reproduction, affiliation, care, and sexual desire. And then I put exploration and play sort of outside of that. I would say because those two things serve both of these approximately equally. I think the postmodern objection to meaning is actually wrong. Well, we talked about this earlier. I do believe that there's a transcendent ethic. And I do believe that it touches on the metaphysical. I believe people experience that because people are perfectly capable of having unutterably profound religious experiences. And the naturalistic materialists don't know what the hell to do with that. They have no idea what to do with that fact. Say, well, it's delusional. It's like, well, hang on a sec. People who have those experiences appear to be more successful and healthier. It's like, so exactly in what manner is that delusional? And if you induce it in the lab with psilocybin, for example, among people who are dying of cancer, their fear of death goes away. It's like, you're going to just lay that out there as delusional, or you'll quit smoking. 85% success rate with one mystical experience on psilocybin produces 85% cessation rate in smoking. Yeah. It's completely. And with MDMA, ecstasy, the 3 treatments with MDMA, that's what the current research indicates, produces a 72% cure rate for intractable post-traumatic stress disorder. It's like, those are miracle cures, and they have to be accompanied by the mystical experience. No one knows how to account for that. And so there is a transcendent ethic.
So it's a very physical thing. I mean, in a case like that, you talk about ayahuasca or any of these things, right? You're eating something, you're ingesting something, smoking it, whatever it is. It's physical, it's here and now, but the experience
is metaphysical. Sure, that's a place where the biological and the transcendent touch. And we don't know what to make of that.
Yeah.
Well, that's why psychedelics threw our whole culture into such a flip this upside down. No one knew what to do with them. You know, I mean, the Indians regarded psilocybin as food of the gods for a reason. And when people have encountered psychedelic substances throughout human history, that's always how they've been characterized. That's right, food of the gods. It's like, beware of them. But they open the door to the transcendent. And, well, I think the evidence that they are doing something, that psychedelic substances are doing something that we seriously don't understand at all, not a bit, is overwhelming. Rick Strassman wrote a book on his experiences giving DMT to a whole bunch of people down in Austin, I think. And Strassman's a pretty straight scientist. You know, he was interested in measuring psychophysiological responses to the drugs. Well, he'd give people DMT and they all came back with the same story. I was blasted out of my consciousness. I met a whole bunch of alien beings. They were really surprised I was there, and then I came back, and it was the most real thing that's ever happened to me. And Strassman would say, well, you know, you had a Jungian archetypal experience, or it was a dream, and they'd say, you don't understand.
Yeah.
And he got so distraught because of these continual reports that he had to stop doing the research.
Yeah,
and I'm not making a claim for anything metaphysical here, but I'm definitely pointing out that there are undeniable realms of human experience that involve religious experience and a sense of the infinite transcendent that look like they're healthy and that you cannot deny. So you see on the left-hand side there, you see Horus, who's the bird-headed god of Egypt, who I told you about, who represents the capacity to pay attention. Very important concept, because the Egyptians realized, and really it's brilliant, it is something modern people do not understand, because we tend to make rationality the highest god. That's not a good thing. That's a pathway to totalitarianism. What the Egyptians knew, but they only knew it in symbolic form, was it was the capacity to attend to things that in some sense was the highest psychological function. Because it's the capacity to pay attention that actually moves you beyond what you only know. And rationality tends to make, you know, integral systems that are coherent, that are box-like, and then claim that they're absolutely right. Whereas attention is always looking beyond what you know. And attention is an unbelievably powerful force. You know, that's why advertisers pay for it. That's why people demand it. That's why children can't live without it. That's why it's what you want from your friends and your family. You want them to pay attention to you. It's an unbelievably valuable resource. And so one of the things I always tell my clients, for example, if they're socially anxious, I say, look, pay more attention to the person you're talking to. If you really pay close attention to them, then the thoughts that are making you anxious will be suppressed. And because you're paying close attention to them, you'll match your movements to theirs, and you'll match your conversation to them, and then there's no reason for you to be socially anxious, because socially anxious people will go like this when they're talking. You know, they don't want to look at you. Of course, how the hell can you engage anyone if you're not in a little dance with them? You know, you can't, and a lot of it's nonverbal, it's physical, and it's embodied, and without paying attention, then you lose people. And you see this with speakers all the time too. They're in front of audiences. They have their paper and they're going like this, and usually they're talking like this too. And you know, the logical thing to do in that case is like look at Facebook or get the hell out of there or something. But they're not paying attention to the audience. And so there's no power in the dynamic conversation at all.
One of the experiences that I had when I was, this would be in 1985 or thereabouts, when I was busily working on the first draft of my book, Maps of Meaning, where I was outlining this idea that the path of the hero who voluntarily confronts uncertainty and stands on the border between chaos and order is the appropriate target for human development. It's an alternative to the chaos of nihilism and the totalitarianism of rigid belief.
Yes.
So, and that's the bearing of responsibility for being. I was working all of that out. It's actually an answer to the postmodern conundrum, as far as I can tell as well. But anyways, at the same time, I was making this sculpture, which is about a foot thick. It's made out of layers of what's called foam core, which is styrofoam pressed between two pieces of paper that's about 1/4 of an inch thick. It's often used for backing on prints and so on if you get them framed. I made this piece that I call the meaning of music, and it's a mandala, so it's a circle inscribed inside of a square, although I tried to make it multidimensional in a complex way that I can't really describe at the moment. But what I was trying to do, and I broke it into pieces, what I was trying to do was to produce a visual object that flickered and changed when you looked at it because it was too complex to process visually. You know, like a Necker cube, that's one of those cubes that reverses when you look at it.
Yes.
Yeah, well, this is like a Necker cube on steroids. And because music, of course, it stays the same across time, but also transforms across time.
Yes.
And it's full of layered patterns, you know, and the patterns interact harmoniously with one another. And it had appeared, and I was fascinated by music because it gives people the direct intimation of meaning. Even if they're nihilistic punk rockers, they still can't criticize the experience of meaning that they engage in when they're listening to their favorite band. It helps them transcend the nihilism of their rationality.
Yes.
And you can't argue with it. It's like arguing with dance.
Right.
It's beyond argument. And so I was making this sculpture, and I spent like 4 months on it. I was thinking about it a lot, and I got it mostly assembled. And then I was in my living room in Montreal, and I was listening to Mozart's Fourth Symphony, the Jupiter Symphony, and I was really listening to it. And it's one of these complexly multi-level pattern pieces of auditory sculpture that I believe represents being, because what being is multiple levels of patterned transformation interacting simultaneously. And music is a representation of that, which is why I think we find it meaningful. Anyways, wow. I was listening intently to this symphony, and at the same time I was concentrating on the sculpture that I had made, and all of a sudden, and everything I'm about to say is a metaphor because there's no way of encapsulating it properly in words, but it was as if the heavens opened up above me. I mean, I was still in my living room, but
yes,
the experience is best represented by one of those early Renaissance paintings where you see God or Christ up in the sky with an opening in the sky against the clouds and against the sun. So it was like that, even though I didn't really see that, but it felt like that. And there was some visuals that were associated with it. And I felt something descend upon me that had a personal nature, you know, something like what you were describing as a higher consciousness that was actually a being of a sort. And it filled me from the inside out. And I had and it was enrapturing, let's say. And it was an incredible feeling. I mean, it was a divine feeling, I suppose, is the right way of thinking about it. It was certainly a religious experience. And it transformed me, and it turned me into something far more than I normally was. And maybe you could think about that as an intimation of what you could become if you worked on it for the rest of your life, which sometimes I think is what hallucinogens provide people with, is an image of who they could be if they shed all of their deadwood.
Right.
Anyways, it was as if an offer was being made to me that I could be like that from now on permanently. And I thought, well, I don't know how to do that. I couldn't walk down the street in this condition, in this elevated condition. I wouldn't belong in the world anymore. I wouldn't know how to function. I don't know how I could do it. And so this experience, this thing, say, that was communicating with me, was accepted that as an answer, although I would say with some sorrow, and then it receded. And then I went and talked to my wife, and I told her what had happened, and I was shaking a lot, and like a tremendous amount, and my pupils were completely dilated.
Wow.
Yeah, and that happened to me one other time in a similar manner, although it was more like an echo. It wasn't quite as intense. But, you know, I was concentrating very much on trying to understand the meaning, the central meaning of music, and of course the phenomena of meaning itself. And it seemed like the combination of that intense concentration and the visual stimulation and the music all culminated to produce this transformation of consciousness, but that was its nature. Amanita muscaria mushrooms are often by mushrooms like psilocybin.
Yes.
And those substances are, to call them strange, is barely to scrape the surface.
Have you taken psychedelics?
Yes, I have.
And yes, it sounds like it, because exactly. Yes, you're right. It's the strangest of things, and when it comes to identity and the psychedelics' effect on human identity, it does create an experience that is transcendent to the very temporary human form that we're currently within. And
yes, well, there's a psychiatrist named Rick Strassman who was at the University of Texas, and he had been giving his experimental subjects. He's one of two groups that had got permission to start experimenting with psychedelics again. The other one was a group at Johns Hopkins who've been reporting the consequences of giving experimental subjects psilocybin in its chemical form. They've reported permanent personality transformations on the part of the people who took the psilocybin mushrooms who had a mystical experience. And so what's happened to them, apart from the fact that they regarded the experience as one of the top 2 or 3 experiences of their life in terms of transformation, is that when you give them personality tests a year later, these are 5-factor personality tests, and they test extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. And openness is a creativity dimension, an aesthetic experience creativity dimension. And their scores on openness increase substantially, approximately the equivalent of from the 50th percentile to the 85th percentile, which is 1 standard deviation. They increase and stay that way up to 1 year later. So
wow.
these chemicals, these strange chemicals, produce very long-lasting effects on people's perception, and they do produce intimations of mystical experience. Now, Strassman actually got scared away from his DMT research. He was a pretty, I would say, conservative scientist and was administering DMT intravenously because it has a very short half-life. If you take it any other way, it only lasts about 10 minutes.
Right.
And his people, who were very carefully screened to begin with for sanity and so forth, although they had some experience with psychedelic drugs because they didn't want to introduce naive people to anything like that.
Right.
They all reported being shot out of their body and encountering alien beings.
Yes.
All of them. And they, when Strassman attempted to explain that away as let's call it a hallucination, although technically, if you're hallucinating, you know that you're hallucinating and you know what's real. So these were far deeper than hallucinations.
Right.
Or that they were something like Jungian archetypes, but his subjects insisted that, including people who knew quite a bit about archetypal psychology, insisted that that was not correct, that they were in fact shot out of their bodies into other spaces and dimensions, and that they encountered beings of all sorts of different types, some of whom were surprised to see them, some of whom were happy they were there, some of whom engaged them in conversation. It makes very strange reading.
Yes.
There's no straightforward way of making sense of it. And there's no straightforward way of making sense of the shamanic experiences too. Eliade had thought that those rituals had been, if they were induced by drugs, that was a corrupt form of the original ritual. But I think later scholarship has indicated that that's profoundly wrong, and that the basis of these experiences is in fact hallucinogenic experience of the sort, say, that the Aztecs induced with psilocybin mushrooms or mescaline.
The first thing I'll do is tell you a story about a female neurologist whose name escapes me at the moment. She wrote a book called My Stroke of Insight. Jill Bolte, I think, is her name. And she was a Harvard trained. She had medical training from Harvard in neuropsychological function and knew a lot about hemispheric specialization. We talked a little bit about hemispheric specialization before, and one of the ways of conceptualizing the difference between the two hemispheres is that the left hemisphere operates in known territory and the right hemisphere operates in unknown territory. That's one way of thinking about it. The left hemisphere operates in the orderly domain and the right hemisphere operates in the chaotic domain. Or the left hemisphere operates in the domain of detail and the right hemisphere operates in the domain of the large picture. It's something like that. Now, people differ in their neurological wiring, so those are overgeneralizations, but that's okay. We'll live with that for the time being. It's certainly not an overgeneralization to point out that you do, in fact, have two hemispheres and that their structures differ. And if the connections between them are cut, which could happen, for example, if you had surgery for intractable epilepsy, that each hemisphere would be capable of housing its own consciousness. That's been well documented by a neurologist named Gazzaniga, and Sperry, who did split brain experiments, must be 30 years ago now. So, and we know that the right and the left hemisphere are specialized for different functions. The right hemisphere, for example, seems to be more involved in the generation of negative emotion, and the left hemisphere more involved in the generation of positive emotion and approach. So the right hemisphere stops you and the left hemisphere moves you forward. Anyways, Jill Bolte, I hope I've got that right, had a stroke and maintained consciousness during the stroke and analyzed it while it was happening. And she was able, while it was happening, to hypothesize about what part of her brain was being destroyed. So she had a congenital blood vessel malformation and had an aneurysm. And it just about killed her. But she said that it affected her left hemisphere. And she said that she experienced a sense of divine unity as a consequence of the stroke, because the left hemisphere function was disrupted and destroyed. And so she became right hemisphere dominant. And her experience of that was the dissolution of the specific ego into absolute consciousness, something like that. Now, that's only a case study, and you don't want to make too much of case studies, but there is an overwhelming amount of evidence that those two kinds of consciousness exist. One being your consciousness of you as a localized and specified being, and the other being this capacity to experience oceanic dissolution and the sense of the cosmos being one. Now, why we have those capacities for different conscious experiences is very difficult to understand. I mean, part of me thinks that maybe we have a generic human brain that's the brain of the species, and allied with that we have a specific individual brain, and one is the left hemisphere and the other is the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere being the specific individual brain. And usually it's on and working because you obviously have to take care of yourself as a specific entity and not as a generalized cosmic phenomena. It's hard to dice celery when you're a generalized cosmic phenomena, right? So you have to be more pointed than that. But look, let's make no mistake about it. The fact that those different states of consciousness exist is not disputable. They can be elicited in all sorts of ways. And so I'm going to read you something that Aldous Huxley wrote about this back, I think in 1956. This was after he started his experimentation with mescaline. Because the psychedelics were introduced into Western culture in the 1950s in a whole bunch of different ways. Psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, that was discovered right after the end of World War II. It was discovered by accident, actually, laboratory, Sandoz Labs. The guy who discovered it, Albert Hoffman, had spilled some on his hands. You can absorb it through your skin. And he was biking home and had the world's first LSD trip, which was somewhat of a shock to him, and then to the entire world. Huxley, who was a great literary figure, a real genius, experimented with mescaline in the late 50s. And he wrote a book called The Doors of Perception, which had a huge impact on the emerging psychedelic culture, both on the East Coast at Harvard and on the West Coast with Ken Kesey and his Merry Pranksters, the people who popularized LSD. That's all documented in a book called The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, which I would highly recommend. It's Tom Wolfe. It's a brilliant book. On the East Coast, it was Timothy Leary. I had Timothy Leary's old job at Harvard, so that was kind of cool, in a warped way. So I met people there who knew him, who didn't think much of him also, but who did know him. But Huxley had this mescaline experience, and it transported him to this alternative consciousness. And he said that during his mescaline experience that the entire world glowed from within, like if there was an inner light, like a paradisal inner light, and that everything was deeply meaningful and symbolically suggestive and overwhelming and beautiful and timeless. So he had an experience of divine eternity, I suppose, is the most straightforward way to put that. And we know perfectly well that the psychedelic drugs that all share the same chemical structure, they interact with a brain chemical called serotonin, which is a very, very fundamental neurotransmitter. They all have approximately the same range of effects, although those effects are there's a very large multitude of effects that sort of exist underneath that umbrella. Huxley was staggered by his mescaline experience. He didn't really know what to make of it. And I think that that's the common experience of people who have exceptionally profound psychedelic experiences. And I'll tell you some documentation about that in a moment. But he spent quite a long time trying to come to grips with what this might mean from an intellectual perspective. And Huxley had a great brain. I mean, if someone was going to wrestle with a problem like that, he was a good candidate. He must have had a verbal IQ of 180. I mean, his books are incredibly literate, incredible mastery of language and complexity of characterization and intellectual discourse. Really remarkable. So this is what Huxley had to say after his mescaline experience. He talked about heaven and hell. And he talked about that in reference to bad trips, essentially, because it was known by that point that a psychedelic experience could transport you to an ecstatic domain of divine revelation, but could take you to the worst imaginable place as well. And Huxley was very interested in why you would even have the capacity for experiences like that, and which I think is a very good question, and it's a completely unanswered question. I mean, we don't know much about consciousness, and we know even less about psychedelics, I would say. They are an absolute mystery. I don't think we understand them in the least. Huxley did a good job of starting to at least map out the mysteries of the terrain. He said, like the Earth of 100 years ago, our mind still has its darkest Africas, its unmapped Borneos and Amazonian basins. In relation to the fauna of these regions, we are not yet zoologists. We are mere naturalists and collectors of specimens. The fact is unfortunate, but we have to accept it. We have to make the best of it. However lowly, the work of the collector must be done before we can proceed to the higher scientific tasks of classification, analysis, experiment, and theory making. Like the giraffe and the duck-billed platypus, the creatures inhabiting these remoter regions of the mind are exceedingly improbable. Nevertheless, they exist. They are facts of observation. And as such, they cannot be ignored by anyone who is honestly trying to understand the world in which he lives. When psychiatrists started to study LSD, that was mostly in the late 50s and running forward from that, they thought about the drug as a psychotomimetic, which was a chemical substance that would induce psychosis. But that turned out to not be true, not with the psychedelics, because schizophrenics were given LSD, and the schizophrenics reported that, while the experience was certainly extraordinarily strange, it wasn't like being schizophrenic. And then it was found later that if you gave schizophrenics amphetamines, that made them worse. In fact, you can induce a paranoid psychosis in a normal person by overdosing them with amphetamines. So whatever the hallucinogens or the psychedelics are doing, it's not the same thing as mania, and it's not the same thing as schizophrenia. Not at all. So you can't just write the experience off as an induced psychosis. Whatever it is, independent of its utility or lack thereof, it's not that. Now, it can be induced by drugs. It can be induced by deprivation, right? I mean, there are accounts throughout history of people putting themselves in extreme physiological situations in order to induce transformations of consciousness. Fasting is one of the routes to doing that. Dancing is another route. Isolation, prolonged periods of isolation will also do it. Now, you could say that exposing yourself to any of those in excess produces a state that's indistinguishable from illness, and that there's no reason to assume that the phenomena that are associated with illness have any utility whatsoever. Although it's interesting to me that a disrupted consciousness can produce coherent experiences. It's not exactly what you expect if it was just an illness. You know, if you develop, say, a high fever, your experience isn't transcendent and coherent. It's fragmented and pathologized, and the difference, I think, is quite distinct. Although we don't have to only speculate about that, because there's been enough experimental work done now with hallucinogens and psychedelics to indicate that the notion that what they produce is something that's only akin to pathology is wrong. It's not a matter of opinion at this point in the sequence of scientific and historical investigation. In fact, there was a large-scale study done 10 years ago, 5 years ago, of 200,000 people who had experimented with psychedelics, and they were mentally and physically healthier than people who hadn't on virtually every parameter they examined. In fact, the rate of flashbacks, you've heard of LSD flashbacks, mostly a hypothetical phenomena, but the rate of self-reported flashbacks was higher among the non-psychedelic users than among the psychedelic users. So that was very interesting. It was a huge study. Now, it might be, you could say that those who had experimented with psychedelics were prone to be healthier to begin with, but that still contradicts the pathology argument, so it doesn't matter either way. The pathology argument is contradicted. Now, oh, I did put that in. It was Dr. Jill Bolt Taylor. This is what she said about her stroke. I remember that first day of the stroke with terrific bittersweetness. In the absence of the normal functioning of my left orientation association area, my perception of my physical boundaries was no longer limited to where my skin met air. I felt like a genie liberated from its bottle. It's a good metaphor. The energy of my spirit seemed to flow like a great whale gliding through a sea of silent euphoria. The absence of physical boundary was one of glorious bliss. Recently, this Dr. Roland Griffith, I met him once at a conference in San Francisco, surprise, surprise. A conference on awe, and this was just when he was embarking on his experiments with psilocybin, which were the first experiments on hallucinogens that were permitted by the National Institute of Mental Health in some 3-4 decades. He had to be very careful to lay out the scientific protocols so that the ethics committees would approve the experiments and so that the federal funding agencies would also allow the experiments to go through. He started to experiment with psilocybin, and he's found a number of, and published a number of very interesting results. One was that a single psilocybin trip, and I specify trip because sometimes when people take psilocybin at the doses that Griffith uses, they don't have a psychedelic experience. Most people who take the dose do, but not everyone. Those who take the dose and don't have the mystical experience don't experience the consequences of taking the drug. And the consequences can be quite profound. So one consequence is that if you have the mystical experience that's associated with psilocybin ingestion, you're liable to represent that to others and yourself as one of the 2 or 3 most important experiences of your entire life. So that would be at the same level as the birth of your child or your marriage, let's say, assuming that those were transcendent experiences. But that's but that's how people describe them. So that's very interesting in and of itself. Then the next thing that another thing that Griffith reported was that 1 year after a single psilocybin dose, profound enough to induce a mystical experience, the trait openness of the participants had increased 1 standard deviation, which is a tremendous amount. And so it looked like 1 dose produced a permanent neurological and psychological transformation. Now, I'm not saying that that's a good thing. I'm not saying that because I don't think that openness is an untroubled blessing, but it's certainly a testament to the unbelievable potency of the drugs. There's about a 10% chance, by the way, with psilocybin ingestion of a trip to hell. And so that's certainly something very much worth considering when you're thinking about the potential effects of this kind of experience. So the mystical experience produced by psilocybin is rated by people as the most profound, among the most profound experience of their life, as life-changing. It produces permanent personality transformations. 85% success in smoking cessation with a single dose. Right, that's another thing that Griffiths demonstrated. Now that is mind-boggling because there are chemical treatments for smoking cessation. Bupropion is one. It reduces craving to some degree, but its success rate is nowhere near 85%. Certainly not with a single dose. And so we don't understand how it can be that that occurs, but it's nicely documented by Griffith's team. In this experiment, he gave psilocybin to people who were dying of cancer. Cancer patients often develop chronic, clinically significant symptoms of depression and anxiety. Previous studies suggest that psilocybin may decrease depression and anxiety in cancer patients. Aldous Huxley took LSD on his deathbed, by the way. So the idea that there was something about psychedelic substances that could buffer people against the catastrophes of mortality is an idea that's as old as experimentation with the drug itself. The effects of psilocybin were studied in 51 cancer patients with life-threatening diagnoses and symptoms of depression and or anxiety, unsurprisingly. I don't really know if it's reasonable to describe the emotional state of people diagnosed with cancer of uncertain prognosis or mortal significance as depression, precisely. You know what I mean, is that if you go to the doctor and he tells you that you have intractable fatal cancer, the normative response is to be rather upset and anxious about that. And so one of the things that bothers me about clinical psychiatry and clinical psychology is the automatic presupposition that even overwhelming states of negative emotion are properly categorized as depression. Because I don't think you're depressed when you get a cancer diagnosis. I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I think that you have a big problem. And it's not surprising that you're overwhelmed by negative emotion, and to think about that as a psychiatric malfunction is a major error. But anyways, it's a side issue with regards to this study. The effects of psilocybin were studied in 51 cancer patients with life-threatening diagnosis and symptoms of depression and or anxiety. I cannot imagine how they got this through an ethics committee. It's just, we're going to take people who have uncertain diagnosis of cancer that are potentially life-threatening, and we're going to give them psychedelics. It's like, but they did it. They did it. And I think it's a testament to Griffith's stature as a researcher that was allowable. This was a randomized double-blind crossover trial, very carefully designed clinical investigation. People were assigned to the treatment group or to the drug group or the non-drug group randomly, blindly. And it investigated the effects of the drug also at different doses, which is another hallmark of a well-designed pharmacological study. Very low placebo-like dose, 1 or 3 milligrams per 70 kilograms of body weight, versus a high dose, 22 or 30 milligrams per 70 kilograms of psilocybin, chemical psilocybin, administered in counterbalance sequence with 5 weeks between sessions and a 6-month follow-up. Instructions to participants and staff minimized the effects of expectancy. Participants, staff, and community observers rated participant moods, attitudes, and behaviors throughout the study. That's also the hallmark of a well-designed study, because they didn't rely on a single source of information for the outcome data, right? They got self-reports, that's fine, but they had relatively objective observers also gather data at the same time. High-dose psilocybin produced large decreases in clinician and self-related measures of depressed mood and anxiety, along with increases in quality of life, life meaning and optimism, and decreases in death anxiety. And that's an interesting, it's a subtle and scientifically sparse statement, but it's a very interesting one. It was there's an intimation of a causal relationship here. Increases in quality of life, life meaning, and decreases in death anxiety. I mean, the intimation there is that one of the ways of decreasing your anxiety about death is to increase the felt meaning in your life. And the psilocybin dosages potentiate that, but it's a good thing to know in a general manner if it happens to be a generalizable truth, right? If you're terrified of mortality, terrified of vulnerability, there's always the possibility that the life path that you're following isn't rich enough to buffer you against the negative element of existence. It's a reasonable hypothesis and an optimistic one, I think, although a difficult one. At 6-month follow-up, these changes were sustained, with about 80% of participants continuing to show clinically significant decreases in depressed mood and anxiety. Stephen Ross, commenting about this, he was a co-investigator, said, "It is simply unprecedented in psychiatry that a single dose of a medicine produces these kinds of dramatic and enduring results." Right, which means we have no idea why this happens. Participants attributed improvements in attitudes about life/self, mood, relationships, and spirituality to the high-dose experience, with more than 80% endorsing moderately or greater increased well-being and life satisfaction. Community observers showed corresponding changes. Mystical type psilocybin experience on session day mediated the effect of psilocybin dose on therapeutic outcomes. What that means is that, well, when the researchers were trying to look at a causal relationship between drug ingestion and the positive outcome, the causal relationship was drug ingestion, mystical experience, positive outcome. It wasn't drug ingestion, positive outcome. There had to be the experience produced by the pharmaceutical agent in order for the pharmaceutical agent to have had its effect. Now, we don't know why that is either. I mean, maybe some people needed a higher dose. Who knows? Because people vary tremendously in their sensitivity to pharmaceutical substances. Now, why am I telling you all this? Well, I'm telling you for a variety of reasons. The first is, make no mistake about it, human beings have the capacity for forms of consciousness that are radically unlike our normative forms of consciousness. And the evidence that those alternative forms of consciousness are purely pathological, which is the simplest explanation, right? You perturb a system, it produces pathology, that's negative. That is the simplest explanation. The evidence for that is weak at best, leaving out the bad trip issue, which is non-trivial. The empirical evidence, as it accrues, in fact seems to suggest that the consequence of positive mystical experiences associated with psychedelic intake is overwhelmingly positive, even in extreme situations. And you really can't find a more extreme situation than uncertain cancer diagnosis with concomitant depression and anxiety. Like, I mean, that's not as bad as it gets, but it's kind of in the ballpark. And so the fact that even under circumstances like that, there was the overwhelming probability that the experience would be positive, because that's another thing you wouldn't expect, you know. Even from some of the earliest discussions about psychedelic use that were put forth by people, including Timothy Leary, describing the importance of set, right? So that the early experimenters noted that if you had a psychedelic experience and you were in a bad state or in a bad place, that was one of the precursors to a bad trip, that the negative emotion that you entered the experience with could be magnified tremendously by the chemical substances, so that it was necessary to be somewhere safe, to be around people that you trust, to be in a familiar environment, to get all the variables that you could control under control. But here is a situation where that isn't what's happening at all, because people have this cancer diagnosis of unspecified outcome, and the vast majority of them had a positive experience, and the positive experience had long-lasting positive consequences. So the case that the transcendent experience is not real, that's wrong. It's real. Now, we don't know what that means, because it actually challenges to some degree our concepts of what constitutes real. But it's certainly well within the realm of normative human experience. So it's part of the human capacity. And you know, there's been other neurological experiments too. There's a researcher, a Canadian researcher, if I remember correctly, who invented something he called the God helmet. And it used electromagnetic stimulation, brain stimulation, to induce mystical experiences. Now, I don't remember what part of the brain he was shutting off or activating with that particular gadget, but, and you know, there's all sorts of other indications of this sort of thing that have cropped up in other domains of the neurological literature. For example, it's very common for people who are epileptic to have religious experiences as part of the prodroma to the actual seizure. That was the case with Dostoevsky, for example, who had incredibly intense religious experiences that would culminate in an epileptic seizure. And he said that they were of sufficient quality that he would give up his whole life to have had them. And the funny thing too is that, in my reading of Dostoevsky at least, is that I think that epileptic seizures and the associated mystical experiences were part of what made him a transcendently brilliant author. I don't think that he would have broken through into the domains of insight that he possessed without those strange neurological experiences. And it was certainly not the case that his epilepsy or the experiences that were associated with it produced what you might describe as an impairment in his cognitive function. It's quite the contrary. At least that's how it looks to me. This is a critical issue with regards to the shamanic transformation, is that people go through these terrible experiences, often drug-induced, by the way, with regards to the shaman. They usually use psychedelic chemicals of one form or another, often mushrooms, but they've come up with some very strange concoctions like ayahuasca down in the Amazon. And ayahuasca is an amazing substance. It's made out of the bark of one thing and another plant whose name I don't remember, that hardly even grow in the same place and that have to be cooked together in a special way. And no one has any idea how the damn Amazonians figured that out. It looks impossible. And if you ask them, they say, well, the plants told us how to do it, which, you know, Western people don't find very helpful. But the shamans are perfectly happy with that description. And ayahuasca takes them apart. And it does that in part because it affects the serotonergic system very, very powerfully, like all psychedelics do, and it transports them to another world, and that's how they interpret it. And what we know about psychedelics, you could put in a thimble and then throw the thimble away. We know nothing about psychedelics. There's new experiments going on at Johns Hopkins, for example, with psilocybin, which is part of this active chemical in magic mushrooms. Same structure basically as LSD and mescaline, and all the real psychedelics have basically the same structure, except the one that's derived from Amanita muscaria, which is called muscarinic acid, and it's its own weird thing that no one knows anything about. Anyways, they have profound neurochemical effects in very small doses, and the research group at Johns Hopkins has given psilocybin to research subjects, purified psilocybin, because they started the new experimentation with psychedelics, and that's been banned for like 40 years, because psychedelics were so terrifying to our culture that we just put them away. It's like, whoa, no, we're not going there. And so even from a research perspective, and even though some of the psychedelics look very promising for the treatment of disorders like alcoholism, they recently used psilocybin to help people stop smoking down at Johns Hopkins, and I think they had an 80% success rate, which is just like, that's just absolutely mind-boggling. And so, but if you give people psilocybin and they have a mystical experience, which is very common among people who take these sorts of chemicals, then their personality transforms permanently, such that 1 year later they're 1 standard deviation higher in openness, and openness is the creativity dimension, and that seems to be a permanent transformation, and so that's really remarkable. And about 80% of the people who undergo the Johns Hopkins experiments report that the experience is like one of the 2 or 3 most important things that's ever happened to them. And so, well, that's something, it's like. And then there's this guy named Rick Strassman down at, I think he was at the University of Texas, and he did experimentation with DMT, and DMT, dimethyltryptamine, if I remember correctly, is the active ingredient in ayahuasca, and you produce it in your brain, and it's in plants. It's like a very common chemical, but DMT is a weird hallucinogen because it has an extraordinarily short mechanism of action. It's like, and people who take it report that they're blasted out of their body, like out of a cannon, and then they go out somewhere and encounter beings of various sorts, and then 10 minutes later they're back. And virtually everyone reports that, which is really strange. And so Strassman was giving people DMT intravenously so that the trip would last longer. This was all NIH-funded experimentation, all cleared with the relevant ethics boards, all conducted within the last 10 years. And he basically quit doing it because he was a pretty straight scientist. He was measuring heart rate and pulse and all that sort of thing, trying to look at the physiology, and then the people he was giving these chemicals to kept coming back and telling him these crazy stories, and well, it was too much for him, and no wonder, because they all said the same thing, and he'd say, well, that was a dream, and they'd say, no, and it was the most real thing that ever happened to me, and he'd say, well, it's an archetypal experience, and they'd say, no, that was no archetypal experience. I went somewhere else, and I saw things, and I'm back, and like, I don't care what you think. And like, who the hell knows, right? Because it's all subjective. But the weird thing about it is that everyone's reporting the same thing. How the hell do you account for that? And then the shaman, when they take these psychedelic chemicals, they basically say the same thing. They say, well, first of all, it more or less killed me. That's this. I dissolved to a skeleton, and then I climbed the tree that unites heaven and earth, and I went into the realm of the gods, and they gave me some information, and I'm back. It's like, okay, well, we don't really know what to make of that, and certainly that's what Eliade describes when he describes the shamanic procession, not the shamanic initiation. And there's dissolution to a skeleton first, and then like a death, a symbolic death, or experienced as an actual death, and then bang, up into the realm of the gods, and then they come back. It's a very old idea. I mean, that's a medieval representation of the tunnel that people travel through at the end of their life to find the light, which is a very common near-death experience report, and people don't have any idea what the hell to do with those reports, except say, well, it's the paroxysms of the dying brain, which you'd expect to be a hell of a lot more random, in my opinion. And the idea is there's a rebirth after that. And here This is the Scandinavian representation of that tree that unites earth with heaven. And so there's the Scandinavian representation. It has a snakes down here eating it. And then that's the Amazonian representation. It's like, how the hell do you account for that? I mean, those pictures are so similar that it's beyond belief. Well, you know, we lived in trees for a long time. A long, 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 long time. Millions of years. And there were lots of snakes around them. And so the idea that reality is a tree that's surrounded by a snake that's in us, man. It's down there. It's deep. And there's something about it that's true. Now, not true like we normally think of truth, but true in an entirely different manner. So, and all that's pretty damn strange. We'll stop with this. My son drew this when he was 7 years old. It blew me away, man. I thought it was so cool, so I had it laminated. And so, here is what it is. On the right-hand side, that's order. It's like the yin-yang thing. That's order. Left side, chaos. Right? And those are all mushroom houses, which I thought was amazing. And then there's this river that runs right down the middle, like the line for order and chaos. And then there's this tree that goes up to heaven, and that's heaven up there. It's like there's St. Peter, there's the pearly gates, there's the clouds. It's like, he never went to church, you know. It's like, what the hell? And then there's a little bug there that goes up and down from heaven to earth, and that was him. And I thought, he had a very organized psyche, that kid. He was a very, very stable kid, and still is. And he drew that, and I thought, Jesus, that's just bloody well unbelievable. And I still think that when I look at it. And that's a great example of an archetype. And so we'll see you Tuesday.
So I'm going to read something that Nietzsche wrote in the first part of Beyond Good and Evil, which is a section called The Prejudices of Philosophers. And it's a really good example of the density of this book. One of the ways of conceptualizing Beyond Good and Evil, and I think this is true for most great works it's true of most great works, is that the author of the work unconsciously collects patterns from his or her interaction with the world, and then gives them initial formulation. And the patterns can be deep and multi-level, and the initial formulation translates them into not so much ideas as into the seeds of future ideas. And the more poetic the author happens to be, the more the case that his or her writings contain within it the seeds of future ideas. And where the romantic philosophers or authors, and I think Nietzsche and Dostoevsky are in some sense foremost among them, are particularly notable for their ability to do exactly that. Now, in this particular paragraph not only serves as an example of that, but it also serves as a self-conscious reflection on that, because Nietzsche is writing a paragraph here that is full of the seeds of ideas that will actually bloom and flower to a great degree in the 20th century. But while he's simultaneously revealing those ideas, he's also telling you exactly how he's doing it and how it is that philosophers do it. So it's a spectacular accomplishment. I'm going to read it probably phrase by phrase and then take it apart because it's so dense, and Beyond Good and Evil is like that. It's Nietzsche, when Nietzsche was writing Beyond Good and Evil, he wasn't very well. And because of that, he had to spend a lot of time thinking and not very much time writing. And because he was also brilliant beyond comprehension, his ability to distill what he was thinking into incredibly rich phrases is, I think in some sense, it's beyond parallel. I mean, often if I'm reading a book, if it has any utility at all, I'll mark it. Usually I fold over the top of the page, or sometimes put a yellow sticky note on it if I find a place where there's an idea that's worth returning to, that's particularly worth understanding. And You can't do that with a book like Beyond Good and Evil, because what ends up happening is you have to mark every sentence. And obviously marking every sentence isn't any better than not marking any sentences at all. So, I guess I also might as well tell you why it is worth bothering with a book like this at all. Because it's a very difficult book, and it's also the sort of book that will rattle you up. So Nietzsche is very interested in the problem of value. And the problem of value fundamentally is not the problem of what is the world made of, or even how does the world function, which are more, in some sense, more specifically scientific questions, but how is it that you should conduct yourself in the world? How should you act? And people act towards aims, in a sense, because we're active creatures and we're moving from one point to another. We're moving towards things that we want, and that means that we're guided by our desires. And we're not only guided by desires insofar as we have individual desires, we're guided by the structure that consists of how those desires are related to one another. So, for example, if you have a room full of people, say a room full of children, they're active and they're each pursuing their individual desires, but at some point they may choose to organize themselves into a game. And if they organize themselves into a game, what they're doing, for all intents and purposes, is producing a little society, a little micro-society. And within that micro-society, they're deciding what desires will be currently expressed and how they'll exist in relationship to one another. And that means that they can cooperate without too much conflict, and that they can jointly move towards a joint aim without, and gather all the benefits that might be associated with that. And that might be the accomplishment of the aim, whatever it is, but it also might be just the enjoyment that's to be had in the pursuit of that activity. Now, people do that socially, because we have to do that in order to get along with other people, because our desires have to be melded with those of other people. But we also do it psychologically, and those two things exist in a dance, because as I'm interacting with other people, the demands of the fact that we're interacting require each of us to arrange our desires in a way that's acceptable to everyone else. But at the same time, while we're doing that, we're also observing the process by which those desires are ordered, and then we internalize that process and use that to order our own desires. And so there's a constant mutually informative dance between the individual and the group. And the culmination of that is the organization of society and the simultaneous organization of the psyche. And it's that process that Nietzsche is talking about in these paragraphs. Now, you might ask yourself, well, what's the utility of articulating such things and conceptualizing them and understanding them? And the answer, in some ways, is straightforward. If you don't want to run afoul of your own desires, you have to organize them. Because some of them are short-term, and some of them are medium-term, and some of them are long-term, and some of them aim at this, and some of them aim at that, and it isn't necessarily the case that those desires allow for mutual fulfillment. So, for example, maybe you're very interested in pursuing a sexual relationship with someone, but you're also very interested in having a family and some stability in your life. Or maybe you're interested in pursuing a sexual relationship with a whole sequence of people, but you're also interested in having a family and stabilizing your life. It's not obvious that those desires can exist in the same universe without producing what you might think about as a war. And some of that might be a psychological war, but some of it's also going to be a war that actually occurs in existence while you're fighting through the contradictory consequences of wanting to pursue many people and formulate a stable relationship with one person. Now, part of the reason that you want to think about these sorts of things is because if you think about them and get your thoughts and your value system intelligently and coherently and cogently laid out, then when you act out that value system in the world, you're going to run into less conflict and less uncertainty and less misery, and you're going to have a higher probability of getting what it is that you want, but you're also going to have a higher probability of getting what you want in a way that allows you to cooperate with other people without entering into too much conflict with them. And so in some sense, the purpose that you think, the reason that you think, or the purpose of thinking, is so that you can sort out how you're going to move forward in the world without having to directly run headlong into all the obstacles that you might run into if you were doing such a thing blindly. And so then you might ask yourself, well, why would you bother reading philosophy, or the philosophy written by someone who's great? And the answer to that is that they can help you think these things through in a manner that you would not be capable of doing on your own, you know, because Nietzsche, I mean, it's difficult to estimate how intelligent Nietzsche was, but I suspect he was perhaps 1 in a billion, which would put him far beyond the 99.999th percentile. And there's a massive difference between the ability of people to think as you move farther and farther out into the extremes of intelligence. And when you have the writings of someone who's 1 in a billion, then you can interact with those writings in a way that enables you, if you'll put the time in, to benefit from the spectacular fact of that intelligence. Nietzsche was a full professor by the time he was 24, at a time when he didn't even have to write his dissertation. They just made him a full professor at a time where that never happened. So this is what he has to say in The Prejudices of Philosophers, which is the first chapter of the book Beyond Good and Evil. It has gradually become clear to me what every great philosophy up till now has consisted of, namely the confession of its originator and a species of involuntary and unconscious autobiography. Well, that's a deceptively simple sentence, even though it's not a particularly simple sentence, because it stands on its head what people generally assume about the process of thinking. You generally think that when you're thinking about, as I mentioned before, the structure of the objective world, but Nietzsche is making an entirely different point here, and what he's fundamentally doing is treating the philosopher not as a rational being, but as a living being. And there's a big difference between being a rational being and being a living being, because if you're a living being, your primary goal is to do whatever it is that furthers your life, and if you're a rational being, then your primary goal is to do whatever it is that a rational being might do. And you could say that a living being should first and foremost be a rational being, and in some sense that's the message of the Western Enlightenment. But it's by no means self-evident that that's the case, and it's certainly not something that Nietzsche doesn't believe that people are rational beings. That's certainly not primarily, and more importantly, he isn't exactly convinced that they should be. So for example, one of Nietzsche's most famous maxims is that truth serves life, and that's a very different idea than the purpose of truth, say, is the accurate representation of the objective world. Those aren't the same thing at all. Now you could ask, well, what does it mean for truth to serve life? And if you construed truth that way, what would truth look like? And, you know, the mere statement that truth should serve life doesn't offer you the answers to those questions. But it's the beginning of a different metaphysics. And in some sense, a metaphysics, which is, say, the universe within which a philosopher might operate, a metaphysics is the initial structure of presuppositions within which a view of the world is organized. One presupposition might be human beings are rational and that we're attempting to formulate and improve our sense of the objective world, our formulation of the objective world. And another would be that human beings aren't rational, we're irrational, and that what we're motivated to do is to live, whatever that means, and that the purpose of our thinking and our philosophy should be to facilitate our living. And that's that's one of the foundation blocks of Nietzsche's philosophy. So he's a moral philosopher, fundamentally, because morality is about values, and values, essentially, values are, you could say values are what you aim for, but it's more complicated than that. Values actually constitute the lens through which you view the world. So it's partly what you're aiming at, but it's also partly your conception of who you are now and where you are. And it's also partly your conception of how you're going to get to where it is that you want to be. And it's also partly the psychological system that you use to parse up the world so that it reveals to you the pathway that you can take to get to what you want. Value is all of that, and then it's more than that, because you could say that you have a value, which contains all of that, but then you can say that you have a set of values, which is the arrangement of all of that, and then you could say that you have a set of values that's the arrangement of all of that you have to arrange with other people, and then you could say that you have all that and you have to arrange it with other people, and you have to arrange it across different spans of time, because what you want today and what you want next week and what you want next month are not necessarily the same thing, and one does not necessarily lead into the other. So to be a moral philosopher is to examine what that system is and how it operates and how it came about. Now, one of the things that Nietzsche says is, it has gradually become clear to me what every great philosophy up till now has consisted of, namely the confession of its originator and a species of involuntary and unconscious autobiography. So his claim fundamentally is that no matter what the philosopher thinks he's doing while he's writing philosophy, what he's actually doing is revealing and articulating his being. And then you might say, well, where did that being come from? And the answer to that is, well, partly you could consider it a biological function insofar as that we have value structures that are built into us, that are the process, we would say, the process of a very long evolutionary history. But because you're also a cultural phenomena, and because the manner in which you've arranged your values and your desires has been conditioned to the last degree by the process of enculturation that you were subjected to, when you confess in an autobiographical manner and articulate that, what you're also doing is recapitulating the entire structure of your culture. It's in you, and you might say, well, where is it in you? And and what does in you mean? Part of it means is that you act out a pattern of behavior, and that pattern of behavior is like a dance that someone is manifesting to a symphonic score. It's unbelievably complicated, and it has its psychological elements, and some of those are conscious and some of them aren't. Some of them are just implicit and embedded in the way you act and the way you perceive, and what the philosopher is attempting to do is to reveal those to himself and to articulate them so that the entire structure can be analyzed. Well, so Nietzsche's first proposition is that when a philosopher is thinking, that what he's doing is not thinking, it's revealing himself in an autobiographical sense under the guise of rational thinking, and so then it becomes something more like a story. And he covers all that in the first two phrases. So that gives you some example, some indication of what this book is like. A species of involuntary and unconscious autobiography. Well, that's a more complicated idea too, because you might say, well, why would someone be driven in an involuntary way and an unconscious way to describe their autobiography? And that's a very complicated question. It might be that one of the reasons that people value one another is because we engage in the process of sharing deeply autobiographical information. You tell me your story and I tell you my story, and you might say, well, why do we even bother with such things? And the answer to that is, well, if you can tell me about the pain and tragedy that you've encountered, then that gives me a better vision of the dangers of the world, without actually having to expose myself to those dangers, except in simulation. I might feel sorry for you, I might feel bad about your tragic experiences, but I'm not bleeding for them. And then there's always the possibility that you'll also tell me how you solved your problem. in which case I can either avoid that problem entirely, or if I do encounter, I can solve it without having to go through, maybe it took you decades to formulate your solution to that problem. And you can tell me your story, and then I have the information. And so that's part of what human beings are always trading. That's why we talk to each other. That's why we can communicate. And so Nietzsche would say, well, it's involuntary, unconscious, involuntary and unconscious. He's alluding to the fact that that proclivity is so deeply embedded in people, that desire to make an autobiographical recounting, that it serves as the kind of motivation that we don't question for doing almost everything that we do. So, you know, I mean, people do such things as attend movies and plays, and they usually do that happily, especially if the movie or the play is of high quality, and the same thing happens when people are reading novels. They're attracted to such things. They have a built-in value, and it's very rarely the case that people will ever question why it is that they're doing such things. In fact, you see this quite commonly with students who are first introduced to the study of literature. The introduction of the idea that you should analyze what it is that you're engaged in when you're reading actually comes as unwelcome news to most people who are inclined towards fiction, because they don't want to interfere with the process of engagement, you know, automatic unconscious engagement with the material, by detaching themselves and having to think about what they're doing. So that's why it's involuntary and unconscious. It's one of the things within which thought operates, rather than one of the things on which thought operates. Then he says, the moral or immoral purpose in which every philosophy has constituted, the moral or immoral purpose in every philosophy has constituted the true vital germ out of which the entire plant has always grown. Well, that's a hell of a thing to say too, because what Nietzsche is alluding to there in some sense is that the philosopher can't help, and that would be in some sense also the person who's recounting their autobiography, can't help but tell you what they're up to, even though they might not know. And this is something that Jung, because Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst, was a great student of Nietzsche. And Jung came to believe that we all inhabited stories, that the stories we inhabited were actually the structures of value within which we lived, and that those stories essentially had an ethic or a moral. And then you can start thinking about what the ethics and the morals might be, and you kind of have some sense of that, because there's comedic stories and tragic stories, and there's evil characters and good characters and so forth. Those are archetypal characters. But part of the point that Nietzsche is attempting to make here is that the philosopher is in fact aiming at something with his life, with all of his actions. He might not even know what it is, but partly what he's doing in his attempt to philosophize is to articulate that and reveal it to himself and to other people. So then the question becomes, well, what is it that the person is up to? And I would say in some sense that's the ultimate question. And so Nietzsche here in this paragraph is also dealing with the ultimate question in life, which might be, well, to what is your life aimed? And you might say, well, it's not aimed at anything. I don't know. I don't seem to have any coherent set of beliefs. I don't know what I believe. I don't believe in anything, even. But that's not the case, because if you didn't believe in anything, you couldn't see. You have to believe in something to be able to see, because you point your eyes at things, and you can't organize your vision without having an aim. And so the very act of interacting with the world presupposes an ethic. And then all those micro-ethics that you contain within you are organized into some sort of structure, either badly or well, and that structure roughly has an aim. And you might know it and you might not, but that doesn't mean it isn't there. So another thing that Nietzsche is alluding to is that you believe things whether or not you think you believe them. In fact, believing them and knowing you believe them aren't even the same thing. And so that people believe all sorts of things that they don't know about. And that partly what they're doing when they're doing philosophy is to try to figure out what those things are. And you know, and you can also ask yourself, well, where did they come from? Well, they partly came from you, but you're an old thing. Your physical form is 3.5 billion years old. And you're the process of all that all the death and struggling that went along the entire course of that 3.5 billion years, is you carry that with you. And then on top of that, inside you is the consequence of the entire cultural history of complex life. That's all inside you too. And then on top of that, some of that's articulated, more or less. Some of it's acted out, dramatized, represented in fiction and that sort of thing. And then some of it's articulated. But there's way more at the bottom than is fully articulated. And so God only knows what you're up to. And then you might say, well, who cares? Well, the problem with that is that you care, because first of all, that's the definition of caring. And second of all, that determines the way that you'll move through your life. And everything that happens to you that's good or evil or good or bad is going to be a consequence of the manifestation of that ethic in the world. So, and now Nietzsche is saying something else too when he says, the moral or immoral purpose in the moral or immoral purpose in every philosophy has constituted the true vital germ out of which the entire plant has always grown. He's saying that the philosopher can't help but reveal his aim in his writings. And then he's saying something else, which is that aim might be malevolent. And, you know, modern people aren't very comfortable with ideas like malevolence, because malevolence is an idea that's related to evil. And modern people think of themselves as beyond good and evil to some degree. They don't believe in the reality of those concepts. And of course, in this book, Nietzsche is also questioning at least our a priori presuppositions about what good and evil are. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't believe that they don't exist. That doesn't mean that he doesn't believe that they don't exist. Yes, I guess that's right. You know, this is one of the things I've thought about when I thought about how Hitler died. You know, Hitler committed suicide in a bunker underneath Berlin when Europe was in flames. And so one conclusion that a psychoanalytically minded historian could derive from that is that's what he wanted. Right? And then that opens up a vast nest of snakes, because one of the things that you might ask is, well, how is it that someone would desire that? First of all, could that even be desired? Is that actually something that anyone could even desire? Then you might ask, well, why is it that someone would desire that? And then the next thing you might ask is, if a human being could desire that, and Hitler was a human being, then exactly what does that say about you? And you might say, well, I could never desire such a thing. But following along the train of the argument that we've been laying out is like, what makes you think you're a reliable judge of what it is that you're up to? So, okay, so now we've unpacked 3 sentences, and we'll continue on with the same paragraph. Indeed, to understand how the most abstract metaphysical assertions of a philosopher have been arrived at, it is always well and wise to first ask oneself, what morality do they, or does he aim at? So the question is, what's the person up to? Well, there's an entire nest of snakes underneath that sentence, that sequence of propositions as well. And one of them is, well, what does it mean that people are up to something? What does it mean that they're aiming at something? Accordingly, I do not believe that an impulse to knowledge is the father of philosophy, but that another impulse, here as elsewhere, has only made use of knowledge and mistaken knowledge as an instrument. But whoever considers the fundamental impulses of man with a view to determining how far they may have here acted as inspiring them. This is partly why this is going to require editing. It's so complicated to go through.
Alright, so that's going to be it for this. We're right there at the end of this video for Jordan Peterson. Plus, I'm tired of shit. This has been like an hour and a half stream I wasn't planning on doing. So that's it for this time.